For those of you who know me, you know that I have a background in both zoology and theology. And so today I thought I would just have a little conversation with you about evolution. And we can't talk about evolution without bringing up two pillars in the history of evolution. The first is Darwin, and the second is Dawkins. Darwin said that evolution took place through natural selection and variation. He didn't understand anything about modern genetics, so he felt that there was slight differences in every population, and that natural selection acted on those slight differences to produce the survival of the fittest. There are some fundamental issues with his theory. The first is that natural selection, by its very definition, requires something to select upon. And Darwin believed, he never put this in his books, he didn't think it was important, but for him, the origin of life probably took place in a warm little pond somewhere. And that once the first cells were developed, natural selection kicked in. That's the first problem with his theory because he did not understand the profound complexity of a cell. The most basic cell that's been derived from a parasite and kind of knocked out every gene that they could. The simplest cell that we've been able to come up with has approximately 500,000 base pairs in its genome. So that is a lot of information, and that does not consider the proteins and all the other functioning systems that are inside the cell. So that was an enormous assumption. The other thing is that um, there's a bit of circular reasoning in the concept of natural selection and what came to be called the survival of the fittest. And that is, you can explain every single organism this way. In other words, it becomes completely irrefutable. How can you say that this organism is the fittest? Well, it's the fittest because it's there, it survived. How do you know the other organisms weren't better? Well, they didn't survive, so clearly they weren't better. That may work in large animals to some degree, but when you start looking at microorganisms and simpler organisms that may have thousands and thousands of offspring, chances that some small benefit is going to be passed on to the next generation because it happens to be fitter than the other uh, 99,000 eggs that were laid becomes problematic at the very least. And so while it's certain or near certain that natural selection can work in a population to create variances within that population, it is far from clear that there is good evidence that natural selection can actually produce the kind of changes that would change, let's say, a worm into a human being. That that's kind of Darwin in a nutshell. There's a lot more we could discuss. Maybe another time I will. The next, well, actually, there's something else I want to mention about natural selection, and that's where he found his inspiration for that, and it was in what we would call animal husbandry, what he called artificial selection, and that is in breeding. So he actually had experience with pigeon breeding, and he found and saw that you could make a lot of variations within the pigeon just by controlling breeding. This was true whether you're talking about dogs, cats, horses, and he extrapolated that to apply to evolution. That given enough time, uh, we could see whole new species arising from another species. The issue with that is that he is missing a very important and obvious fact, and that is that there is intelligence imposed on the system when you're talking about animal breeders. They have a specific end goal in mind and they are trying to achieve it. So if they're trying to breed for a larger dog, they would continue to breed larger dogs together until at such time as they reach the outer limit, which is the other problem with animal husbandry, and that is it's much uh, intensive pressure that's been placed on animals such as a dog, for example, that's been domesticated for many, many thousands of years. There's a limit that you reach the outer limit of how far that species can adjust, and then you're facing extinction. So that applies to many arguments you hear about evolution. Think about it for a second. One famous evolutionist likened evolution to uh, the changes in cars over the years, but that fails to recognize how much effort and work and development and technology went into advancing the state of the automobile, making improvement after improvement. Each new engineer building off the previous engineers' intelligent, thoughtful um, work. And when it didn't work, they cast the rejects aside. So, yes, cars have evolved, cars have gotten better and better, but it's not by random, uh, directionless process. It's absolutely directed. Anyway, so to give you a quick nutshell discussion on Dawkins, Dawkins popularized what's called the modern synthesis. So it took Darwin's idea of natural selection and variance within a population and added random mutation. So popularly expressed, evolution is now natural selection acting on random mutation. And once again, um, Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he used an example of evolution as well. But again, uh, there is a lot of intelligence imposed on the system. So he talked about uh, sonar and how that developed over time through the war and then in the post war years, how it became more and more accurate and precise. But that involved human agency, that involved intelligence. And it's interesting that Dawkins should use the case of sonar because the discovery that's made quite recently in looking at animals that use sonar or radar, that's as in bats and dolphins, they've discovered that when it comes to the genes that control hearing and other aspects of the bats and the dolphins, that they are virtually identical. That the processes used to hear underwater and to hear with their eyes in the atmosphere, in the case with bats, they're using the very same programming. Now, I'm sure that evolutionists will give you an evolutionary explanation for that. But I want you to just stop and think for a second. Does that really seem plausible? Surely there is no common ancestor in a bat and dolphin that used radar or sonar, depending on which animal you're talking about. So, how could it be that this would happen twice? That the animal would find what it wasn't looking for in blind chance, these very complex proteins and genetic information that gives rise to echolocation. One scientist said a bat is practically a flying dolphin, and a dolphin is practically a swimming bat when it comes to the genes that regulate echolocation. Does that not sound more like a designer or a programmer would take a specific program that could be used to develop echolocation, and then take that program, and when uh, creating or designing animals, would plug and play that particular module, and lo and behold, you have this process. It's even more profoundly the case with eyesight. The prediction is that vision developed 40 times throughout history in separate times, common ancestors that did not have eyesight. And yet they use the same genes, they use the same proteins. They may have different um, eyes to see, but the basic chemical, basic genetic component's the same. Sounds a lot like design to me.